Why Australia entered the war. When Britain declared war in 1914, it declared war on behalf of the entire British Empire, that included Australia. Australia became involved in World War I in August 1914, as Britain was preparing to declare war on Germany. At the time, Andrew Fisher, future Australian Prime Minister, promised that Australia would stand behind their mother country. He believed this war was to be a noble cause where Australia could demonstrate their loyalty. Australia became involved in World War I for three main reasons. Firstly, although they were known as a nation of its own, they still held close ties to the mother country, Britain. Secondly, if Australia became involved, other countries would have a greater respect for the new nation. Thirdly, at the time, Andrew Fisher promised that Australia would stand behind the mother country. On September 3, 1939, Australia declared war on Germany and entered the war in Europe to aid its allies in the United Kingdom. The main reason that Australia joined the First World War was because they felt they needed to defend their mother country, Britain, and it would be disloyal of them if they didn't, and also wanted the respect from the other countries if they had helped them in the war. The reason that Australia joined World War II was because they wanted to declare war on Germany, and they were also allies with the United Kingdom, and they were also fighting alongside of Europe.
Impact of war on the home front. When war broke out in September 1939, the Australian government was much better prepared for it than in 1914. As in 1914, most Australians seemed to support the decision to be involved in the war. All major parties, churches and newspapers supported the involvement. The government deliberately moved more slowly and in more organized way. They had learned from 1914, when many men in essential occupations had been allowed to enlist, to harm of home front effort. As in World War I, the Commonwealth government imposed a large number of new controls over the people's lives. They did this through the authority of National Security Act of 1939. This act did two major things. One, it effectively overrode the Constitution for the duration of the war, giving the Commonwealth power to make laws in areas where it did not have the power under the Constitution. 2. It effectively overrode the power of the Parliament by giving the government power to make regulations, laws that are required only to signature of some ministers and governor-generals.
The role of women in the wars. Before World War I, women generally worked in roles that were deemed as women's work. These roles included domestic services such as cleaning, the textile industry, clothing and teaching. During World War I on the home front, women had to adapt to fill the positions of men that went off to war. Great Britain saw this as dilution. The trade unions were against dilution, which saw women work in positions that they thought required skilled men. The trade unions made an agreement with the government that stated when the war ended, the women would lose their jobs and continue on with roles suited for them. During World War I, in the military service, nursing was the only area that a female contributed in. The nursing involved being at the front and experiencing war. The Russian Provisional Government of 1917 were the only government to introduce a few all-women battalions. The women fought well, but could not withhold the pressures of active combat. With the coming of World War II, the nation depended more on the labour of women, whether it be in munitions factories or building ships or aircraft. By 1945, more than 2.2 million women were working in industries associated with war. In allied countries, women enrolled in military nursing, but thousands joined women militias on the home front. And also in international combat, women serving in the military generally joined the Red Army. Many women also served in the European resistances and the British SOE. Even though women were more involved in the World War II war effort, they were never treated as equals amongst the men. Many high-ranking and commanding officers kept them out of combat on purpose because they did not see them as equals.
The issues of conscription. In World War I, there wasn't a lot of Australian men contributing to the war. According to the AIF, Australian Imperial Force, less than half of the usual 16,500 men per month had went off to fight in 1916. The difference between World War I and World War II had a major number of men. In World War II, soon after the war had broken out in Europe, the Australian government had introduced conscription for the defence of Australian territories and their people. It was compulsory to the 20-year-old single men to head off to a war training camp. This was introduced in 1939. The AIF had made 80,000 men immediately called to fight in the war. Because of what the people had experienced in World War I, they knew what would happen if they had less men in Australia fight. We would fall, and this is why we needed more men. So then the government had an idea. They would put up posters all over the town, encouraging people to fight in the war, and it had worked. 50,000 to 80,000 men had went and fought in the war.
The soldiers' experience. There were many differences between the experiences of soldiers in World War I and II. World War I was mainly static. Millions of soldiers faced each other across trench lines, and there was little movement for 3 years. Though some of the fighting occurred in the desert of North Africa, the technology was relatively primitive. Though machine guns were already deadly weapons, and early tanks and aircraft played an important part in many battles, poison gas was a dreadful weapon, which filled soldiers on all sides with fear. World War II was far more mobile, partly because methods of transport had improved significantly, and partly because of the different terrain. It was fought across a wider variety of theatres, including desert and jungle. For the first time, Australian soldiers were fighting close to home to prevent an invasion of their country. Fear would have been in their hearts, since they were the last line of defence, because the war was at Australia's doorstep. Technology had advanced dramatically, and aircraft and tanks especially were far more deadly. Furthermore, World War II introduced the world to nuclear weapons. A similarity of both wars was the Australian troops used the rifle called Lee Enfield 0.303.